So the first step in putting together an effective research paper is to specify the outcome. You have selected two or more of your cases, and now you want to specify what the similarities and differences are across those cases that you seek to explain. In other words, specifying the outcome, or what you also call your dependent variable, is a key first step to articulating a clear and precise research question. And there are four factors that you would want to take into consideration in specifying the outcome. The first one is to specify what exactly is your unit of analysis. Secondly, how comparable are the cases that you have selected? Thirdly, what is your unit of measurement? And finally, what are some of the possible patterns that could be observed across those cases? So I will elaborate on those four factors in the rest of this lecture. Now, in terms of your rationale map, the outcome would be here on the far left of the map. And what you would use for this is one of the basis boxes, and then specify your outcome. And the outcome could be in the form of a table like this, or in terms of graphs. But we'll talk more about this towards the end of this presentation. Any phenomena that you will end up studying will vary tremendously in terms of the range of generality or specificity at which it could be studied. And in the social sciences, we talk about the unit of analysis in order to talk about at what level of generality you are analyzing a particular phenomena. So here, let me just give you different possible units of analysis that you might encounter and illustrate it with an example of studying economic phenomena. So here, this is the most general, and this is the most specific. So you have a range here in terms of the level of specificity. So you could study economic phenomena at an international system. At this point, you would look at multinational corporations or global markets. That's very broad, very, very general. That's sort of a big bird's perspective. Or you could be a little bit more specific and focus on individual countries. Then you would compare the national economies of Japan and the United States. Or you could then go down one level of generality and compare subnational economies, comparing how Texas economy performed relative to that of New York State, or regional economies, the Northeast with the Southwest, and so forth. Or you could go down one further step of generality and focus on different types of organizations. Then you would be studying corporations, banks, bureaucracies, or interest groups. Or you could focus on social groups that work inside organizations. You could look at managers, employees, white, blue-collar workers, female employees, and so forth. Or you could go all the way down to individuals, and then you would look at the chief executive officers, the chief financial officers, individual board members, or investors. So try to think at what level of generality you are analyzing your data. What level of analysis might be the most appropriate for engaging the particular question that you're trying to answer. And moreover, try to be careful that your unit of analysis is the same across the two different cases that you're comparing. So, don't compare in one case the economy of a country, and in another case you're focusing on corporations. That would be an asymmetrical or comparison that doesn't really work too well. Now, the issue of comparability arises in that you have selected two cases that differ on the dimension that you seek to explain. But those two cases also have a whole host of other characteristics where you have to ask yourselves how comparable or how different are these other factors. So that gets us to the question of comparability. The first thing that you want to focus on is the substantive comparability. That is, the two cases that you are comparing, or the units of analysis that you're comparing. How similar are they to one another? So, for example, if you are comparing the oil industry in the United States and Russia, you have two units of analysis that are substantively very similar. That is, they are engaged in the very same economic type of activity. So the comparability there is not really an issue. But if you compare, for example, the oil industry in the United States with car manufacturing in Germany, you have two very different sectors of the economy that are very different. Now, this might not be a problem, but you then have to sort of tell the reader why this difference makes for an interesting comparison. So the first thing is to sort of focus on the substantive qualities of your unit of analysis and how similar and different they are. The second focus is on the geographic comparability. Now, if you are, for example, comparing the oil industry in Canada and the United States, these are two countries that are right next to each other. They're in close geographic comparability. So again, they're highly comparable and you don't need to explain much. But if you compare the oil industry in the United States and Russia, these are in two very different parts of the world that have different geological, political, and climate differences. So you may want to let the reader know how those differences affect your analysis and why you've selected them. And thirdly, you also want to give some attention to the temporal comparability of your cases. In most instances, you will compare your two cases at the same point in time. For most of you, this will be something that is happening right now or has been happening in the recent past. Again, if the time period is exactly the same, point that out and you don't need to explain much. But if, on the other hand, you compare your units of analysis that take place in very different points in time, you want to highlight that and let us know, for example, what do we learn if we compare both the American and Canadian oil industry at the present and 30 years ago. What you definitely want to avoid is where you compare two units of analysis, where one is at one particular moment in time, in the other at another moment in time, and you assume, you pretend that these two moments in time are happening at the same moment in time. Finally, ask yourself what sort of evidence, what type of evidence will you be using in order to describe the similarities and differences across your cases. And this gets us to what we call the unit of measurement. And there are essentially three different types: nominal, ordinal, and then interval ratio. Nominal units of measurement is just a different word for essentially qualitative evidence that you use. So you differentiate the similarities and differences in terms of broad categories. In the example here, we have Russian, Finnish, and Norwegian. And so nominal evidence would involve describing the difference in terms of the Russian language and Finnish language, Russian culture and Finnish culture, and so forth. So you use broad nominal categories to distinguish categories of information, of knowledge, and then you would elaborate on those differences largely through description. The second category is ordinal. In this case, you would differentiate the similarities and differences in terms of a slightly more refined set of categories where you now can make some ranking in terms of the differences, that something is, like the upper middle class or lower middle class. Again, you can't quantify this, but you would specify certain characteristics associated with the upper middle class, certain professions, certain levels of income that would differentiate from the lower middle class. And then you have some intermediate categories that would fit between these two endpoints of the continuum. And finally, interval and ratio. These are essentially, now you use numbers, numerical differences, to articulate and describe the variations across your cases. And in many ways, those are the most succinct, the most effective type of information in order to compare and contrast your cases. So whenever you have interval ratio evidence or quantitative evidence available, try to use it. You can also sort of chart it in tables and figures and add a lot of nuance and details in a very short space of time. But such evidence is not always readily available. In those cases, then you might have to draw on ordinal or nominal units of measurement. So here is a quick overview of some of the possible patterns that you might be able to observe. In most instances, you will just make some differentiations between one country being high on a certain characteristic, low or medium. But in instances where you have some data that extends over time and you can see some trends, here you have an interesting sort of inventory of possible trends. The trend could be either flat, up, or going down. If it goes up or down, the rate of change might be different. It might be a slow rate that gives you sort of a gradual, a flat upward line, or the rate of change could be very rapid, then you get a steeper line. Or the trends over time vary in terms of variability. So in both of these instances, right, you have an upward trend, but notice here the upward trend varies a great deal, has a high degree of variability, whereas here the variability is much, much smaller. Or here there's not an upward trend, but the trend is relatively flat, but there are certain patterns. And so here what you have is essentially you have certain patterns that reappear. So you have a cyclical-like trend, whereas here there is no cyclical pattern observable. Instead, it seems to be more random. Or here is the rate of upward growth. So here it's a linear rate where it's gradual, and this is a curvilinear here, where at the beginning the rate of increase is relatively small, and then it picks up and increases. So these are just some of the possible patterns that you might be observing as you compare your cases. The last 5 case patterns here really apply only if you have some data across time. So for most of you, this category here would be the most relevant. So let us return back to our sample paper and use it as an illustration for how a previous research paper specified the outcomes. You remember this is the section taken from the paper that compares the decline of railroads in Nigeria and Eastern Africa. And essentially the argument was that these railroads declined rapidly and were displaced by trucks, and that was the research question. So what you see here is the section that specifies the outcome, and I just wanted to quickly go through some of the potential issues that we face here. Now, before we go into the details, as you may recall, this section does an adequate job in demonstrating the decline of railroads in Nigeria and East Africa. But I think this section could have been more effective. First of all, right here, it really would have been helpful to start with a topic sentence that summarizes the overall finding. The topic sentence should read something like, there has been a gradual decline in the freight and passengers that railroads in East Africa and Kenya experienced over the period between roughly 1965 to the present. Instead of a topic sentence here, we plunge right into the particulars of the East Africa railways, and so this makes it a little bit difficult for the reader to sort of follow and digest what is about to come and be discussed in this section. The second thing that could have been more effective is talk us a little bit about the comparability of these two railroads. It really would be helpful to give the reader a sense of how similar and different these railroads are. I mean, could it possibly be that the Nigerian railroad was largely a commuter railroad, whereas in East Africa it was a national railwork, or vice versa? Give us some sort of sense of how similar and different these two railroads are in terms of their size and the activities that they were engaged in. And that sort of would give us a better sense of the comparability of those two cases. The third issue here is tell us a little bit something about the availability of data. What the paper does here, it just reports the data, but it doesn't tell us how easy it was to find the data, what the limitations were, and so forth. So always bring the reader along and let him or her know how good the data was, what some of the limitations of the data is. Editorialize about the challenges that you faced in finding data. This is particularly important when the data is spotty and not very perfect, as it is in this particular case. The fourth issue is the unit of measurement here. Notice that for the East African Railroad, what we're looking at here is the profitability, right? So here in 1966, it was profitable, and then the deficit increased over time. So the unit of measurement here is an interval. It's numerical. It is across time, and it refers to the profitability. For the Nigerian railroad, on the other hand, what we have here is passenger rail trips and in goods moved. So it still is an interval level data, but it measures a different dimension of the railroad's activity. So in that sense, the units of measurement are slightly different. The third thing that you will have noticed here is the time periods. For the East African, it goes from 1966 to 1971. So essentially what we have here is a 5-year time period. For the Nigerian railroad, on the other hand, we're going from 1963 to 2009. So this is roughly a 50-year time period. So the time periods that are being compared here are very, very different. And to make this more effective, they should be more similar. And finally, in terms of the visualization, notice here, in the Nigerian case, the author just reports the numbers from the starting and the end point. And that's good enough. This gives us some sort of sense of the overall trend. I don't think that we really need a table in here. The table really doesn't add that much, particularly because the data is only available for the East African case and not the Nigerian case. If the author would have had similar data for the Nigerian case, well, then the table would have been a little bit more informative. So I think what the author would have been better off here is take this data, just delete this table and report the data for individual years in the text as he did in this section. So you can see there would have been ample of room in order to improve the discussion of the outcome. And I hope this gives you a little bit of a sense of what you might be shooting for in your own papers.